This is a message for Boris Johnson because I know you've got a big decision to make on HS2, and I know it's going to be a hard decision because on one side you've got the fact that HS2 has been a disaster, complete disaster for the last decade, probably will be for the next two if it goes ahead, with cost overruns, with delays to the project, with a reduction in scope, with rail experts saying it doesn't deliver on the promises and there are better alternatives, and of course with it causing so much ecological damage and actually doing nothing whatsoever to combat the climate crisis. And on the other hand, well, it sounds like it should be a good idea, doesn't it, high speed rail? And there's lots of people lobbying for it, so as I say, a difficult decision. But yeah, high-speed rail does sound like it should be a good idea, and that's what I thought 10 years ago, and it probably would have been if it had followed the Kent principles which were set down after HS1 was built. But it didn't. For some reason, a 250 mile an hour design speed was chosen, probably because vested interest lobbyists persuaded the previous government to let them build the most expensive railway in the history of the world. And of course, it was the most expensive railway in the history of the world back when it was less than a third of the projected cost that it is now. So now, with HS2 having been in real trouble over the last few weeks, we've seen this sort of new Project Fear, run by a lot of the similar organisations at the last Project Fear, warning of dire consequences if HS2 is cancelled, and trying to make out that HS2, a project that will have repercussions going on for decades, can't be cancelled this week because it would look bad if it happened straight after Brexit. Now, if you refuse to be railroaded by those short-term optics, the choice you're now faced with is an easy one. Because choosing to go with HS2 is saying, I'm happy for further inevitable delays, cost overruns, scandals and protests to be a millstone around my neck throughout my premiership. Because on current estimates, you probably have to be in office longer than Margaret Thatcher just to get a train from London to Birmingham as Prime Minister on HS2. And every time there aren't enough beds in a hospital or police on the streets or buses on the roads, people will be saying, they got the money for that HS2, haven't they? Costs have gone up over again. It's just one big gravy train and snaps in the trough for the old boys. That's not going to go away, and it has the potential to define your term in office. So I hope you'll take the sensible option. Ignore the vested interests and invest in the transport infrastructure that we actually need. The infrastructure we need right now. Local transport infrastructure that gets people in and around the towns and cities where they live and work. The simple projects that enable short distance journeys that get people to work, get them out of their cars. That, along with investing in broadband technology that creates jobs where people actually live and reduces the need to travel at all, is what exactly we need to tackle the climate crisis. There is no place in a sustainable 21st century economy for encouraging even more people to travel even greater distances for work. And part of the answer, just part of the answer, was in your manifesto, reversing the beaching cuts, which due to their very nature would have a negligible impact on the natural world, opposed to HS2, which threatens over 100 ancient woodlands and almost 700 wildlife sites. And there's a brilliant example of how reversing beaching delivers tangible benefits in the town where I live. In 2018, Kenilworth Station, which beaching closed, reopened, and then in the first 11 months we had one train an hour going to one destination each way, one way to Coventry, one way to Leamington, 6 days a week. So in 11 months, with one train an hour of one carriage going to one place each way, 170,000 journeys were taken off the road. It had 170,000 passengers with one train an hour because it was delivering the links that people needed to get them to where they wanted to go. And it's fantastic news that you're looking at putting passenger services onto the freight line through Blythe, and looking at doing the same with the mothball line to Fleetwood, because there's about a dozen of these easy win projects, lines that are now mothballed or carry very low levels of freight, lines that only need trains and stations. But this £500 million fund for reversing beaching, it's not going to go very far. That one station in Kenilworth, that cost over £11 million. And what will cut it is a chunk of the HS2 budget. And when you look at the projects that aren't being done, a great example would be the Skipton to Colne railway line. You wonder why HS2 has been prioritised and these things have been lobbied for by locals for years and just haven't happened. 11 miles of track restored gets you a brand new line across the Pennines. And because the track bed is still there, the latest cost of that is £368 million for a brand new line across the Pennines, delivering real benefits to red wall towns like Burnley and Keighley. And even if that 368 is underestimated, I don't think the trains are included in that. You're still talking about less than 1% of the cost of HS2 for a new Transpennine link. And there could be a second Transpennine link by reopening the Woodhead line connecting Sheffield and Manchester. You'd probably need to rebore tunnels 1 and 2 into one big tunnel that can be electrified. But this is not beyond the realms of possibility. And you're looking at a couple of billion for 2 brand new lines across the Pennines. Not within decades, but within years. And there are so many easy tweaks to the current network, like platform extensions that would mean everyone suffering crush hour conditions on Northern, if of course they're lucky enough to get for a train to actually turn up, might have benefits, might have room on those trains. And when you look at that, you have to wonder why these projects haven't been prioritised. And it's because they're small. It's because they don't get loads and loads of people lobbying for it. Just why are there so many business leaders in Northern England saying that HS2 is essential and vital and a game changer, and that without HS2 we can't have Northern Powerhouse Rail? Which is insanity, because the Northern Powerhouse Rail currently on offer at the moment, the plans have been drawn up for no other reason than to prop up the case for HS2. I mean, let's see, the quickest way from Liverpool to Manchester is via Manchester Airport. I don't think it is, but that's where the HS2 track goes. So if you say you'll run it on the HS2 track, it says, oh well, we need the HS2 or we'll never have Northern Powerhouse Rail. The current plans for NPR make all the same mistakes as HS2 for all the same reasons. Lobbyists have drawn up the railway they want to build without there ever being an assessment of the problem it intends to solve and the needs it intends to serve. NPR will be a great idea, but just not what's on the table at the moment. And now we've got this absolute insanity that lobbyists are trying to make out that you can't cancel HS2 because doing so in some way would be betraying the North and the Midland, when exactly the opposite is true. Every single piece of international evidence is, and the very, very clear and obvious effect of our own current hub and spoke transport system, so you will just reinforce the economic dominance of London. You will drag more stuff down to London. At the best, at the very, very best, you will have an uplift around the station sites, but they will be to the detriment of the wider regions, which is why the leaders of those cities that have stations are so for it and are trying to claim that everyone else wants it too. The truth is that HS2 is a perfect example of a Westminster bubble project where politicians think it will do something for the regions because they've been told it does by a load of people wearing suits that probably cost more than I and people like me earn in a month. But what it really does is it benefits London and it leaves the towns and cities that have been left behind even further behind. It's more of the same. But the HS2 lobbyists are basically saying, you see what every high-speed rail network in the rest of the world has done in history? Well, this will do exactly the opposite because I say so. And I'm going to make millions out of it, so you can trust me. And that's why we've got HS2. You can trace it all the way back to the Eddington report in 2006. Eddington said that reports should be prioritised on the basis of need. but warned that high-speed rail solutions were being driven by vested interest lobbyists, and further warned that transport policy could become the pursuit of icons, which should be avoided because momentum builds up behind them, and that makes them difficult to stop. And that's where we are right now. It's seen as difficult to stop HS2 because there are blokes in sharp suits with money that gives them access to high levels in the political system and the media, and they're pulling out all the stops to try and make sure HS2 is difficult to stop. And don't you find it odd that the more and more the costs of HS2 go up, the louder and louder the people who represent the firms that will rake in those billions of pounds of overspent taxpayer money clamour for HS2? And they hit us with this bombastic rhetoric that HS2 is essential and vital and a game changer, and cancelling it would be a disaster and a betrayal, and there is no other choice for delivering capacity and economic growth and milk and honey, and if it doesn't happen, well, you just might as well discontinue the North. I mean, these are the same people who point blank refuse to understand that to govern is to choose, demanding that it's not a case of either or. No, we need both, showing they have as little understanding of how the world works as a child at Christmas, thumbing through the Argos catalogue saying, I want that, and I want that, and I want that, and I want that. They seem not to have noticed the 10 years of austerity we've lived through, or all the projects during that time which were promised but were cut back at the same time as the estimated cost of HS2 trebled. Now, I think it's pretty much accepted that we've been lied to from the start over the cost of HS2. The National Audit Office made it clear last week that Parliament again was misled over the costs, but no one seems to care that that report also showed that the Infrastructure and Projects Authority, the government's own projects watchdog, reported twice last year that the HS2 programme was unachievable, a red rating, unachievable. But the best line in the NAO report sums up HS2 perfectly. You know, the HS2 updated their advice last year and said that whilst phase 1 was unaffordable, yes, unaffordable, it actually says that, the value for money case remains strong. Sorry, it's unaffordable and value for money at the same time. How does that work? Well, how that works is there's been a cosy clique of revolving door employment between HS2 Limited and the contractors, which has seen vested interest driving policy at the taxpayers' expense. And Boris, it's time to take back control. Because if we do accept that they haven't been totally honest about the cost of HS2, it would be naive to not assume that they may not have been totally honest about everything else, the supposed benefits and the supposed need for HS2 too. And now in the face of that, we've got this project fear. And a great example of that is the recent response to government from Network Rail, that to deliver the same sort of capacity as HS2 would need 29 years of weekend closures. That's double disingenuous from Network Rail, because there's always weekend closures. There's always essential maintenance of the railways that requires closures, and you schedule all the work to happen at the same time. To pretend that wouldn't happen when addressing the pinch points is misleading. And possibly the worst bit of their response is that they repeat this myth that the West Coast Main Line is full. There's simply no more room for any more trains. Since we were first told that, the old franchisee, London Midland, added more trains simply by changing the timetable twice. And then just weeks ago, the new intercity franchise holder Avanti said they could add 263 trains per week. That's about 2 an hour on these tracks that Network Rail are saying are full. And just as bad as that, in terms of London to Birmingham, they like to pretend that the Chiltern line doesn't exist. Maybe because it's nowhere near full, it's not even electrified. So you could spend money on that and add capacity, increase speed, decarbonise, and without all the environmental damage. But of course, Network Rail was being asked the wrong question at capacity. They were asked about the capacity HS2 could deliver. ignoring the fact that HS2 doesn't actually deliver the capacity we need. It provides an intercity point-to-point service, delivering capacity where it's needed least, at the highest possible cost for building, maintaining and running. It minimises flexibility, it's decades in the future, and it maximises the environmental damage, minimising interconnectivity, and of course it won't carry any freight. The capacity HS2 provides isn't for the ordinary services people use every day to get into work. It's for trains to London for the political and executive classes that they use once a week or so. HS2 are now saying that if you remove the fast trains off the existing line, that frees up capacity. But you're going to remove all the fast trains off, but those trains stop at other places like Coventry, Sandwell and Dudley, Wolverhampton, Stoke-on-Trent, Macclesfield, Stockport, Wilmslow, Doncaster, Wakefield, Leicester, Nottingham, Derby and Peterborough. So getting rid of those trains sounds a bit more like leaving further behind than levelling up. And there'll probably be more cuts to the cross-country services as well. And the cross-country services are a brilliant example of how you add capacity, because the trains from Birmingham to Manchester and Birmingham to Leeds are half the size of the trains going from Birmingham, Manchester and Leeds to London. It's not difficult to see how you could add capacity there. Longer trains. And as for those other projects, they're easy to find. There's the proposals from Lord Berkeley, the New Economics Foundation, the Taxpayers Alliance, the 51M Optimised Alternative, and many, many more sustainable and deliverable projects that are smaller and not as sexy as HS2, and certainly not the gravy train that it is. Going back to using Kenilworth as an example, the fact that the line between Coventry and Leamington is single-tracked limits capacity for both cross-country and freight routes. But that was meant to get double-tracked as part of Patrick McLaughlin's electric spine programme, which died a death more or less as soon as it was announced. Possibly in the face of HS2 increasing costs. But maybe the most obvious list of projects that need completing are the list of Network Rail's failures, which are actually now being used to justify HS2. Programmes like the cancelled electrification of the Midland Main Line and that last bit of the Great Western, they leave a bitter taste in the mouth, as does the promise to relieve Dawlish by reopening an inland route, something which shows very little sign of happening. But perhaps the worst case of Network Rail failure was this supposed much vaunted upgrade of the West Coast Main Line in the previous decade. As first, it ignores that the majority of that spend was actually essential maintenance and infrastructure, overdue maintenance. But the main objective of the upgrade parts didn't really actually happen. The tracks were made capable of 140 miles an hour. The trains were ordered that would do 140 miles an hour, but the money ran out. And the signals, the missing piece that would have actually allowed for 140 miles an hour and increased capacity as well, they never appeared. And those digital signals that will surely have to be installed all over the network eventually just don't seem to be happening. They might eventually turn up for East Coast Main Line, but West Coast was meant to have them 15 years ago. So the options are there for investing in rail and upgrading our rail infrastructure across the whole network, benefiting more people than HS2 ever could and doing it so much more quickly. Those options have always been there, the same way that HS2 is, has and will always be the wrong project. And the way I see it, you're going to upset people whatever you choose to do. But the good news is if you decide to cancel HS2, the people you'd upset, they'll get over it. Because there will be something else, something better, something more sustainable that delivers more benefits to more people more quickly for less money. But if you go ahead with HS2, the people you'll upset, well, they'll stay upset. They will see that your first real choice was to side with the lobbyists from the vested commercial interests who've been running their own gravy train, just like all their preconceptions might expect them to see a Tory leader do. They will see that despite the declaration of a climate crisis, your first decision is to greenlight a project that will only make it worse, with the official HS2 forecast showing it to be a carbon contributor 120 years into the future, ignoring the very real need for immediate action on that crisis. And they will see that, unlike your predecessors who blindly supported HS2 and ignored the scrutiny and well-founded criticism, you did call a review, but allowed it to be written by the Department for Transport and based on evidence from HS2 Limited, when we all thought the whole point was to independently investigate the actions of the DFT and HS2 Limited. It would be basically sending a signal that they could get away with anything. I would suggest that instead of reading the Oakham report, it would be more worthwhile use of your time to try and catch up with the progress of the Serious Fraud Office investigation. Because it's only a matter of time before the allegations of malfeasance and cover-up become more public knowledge. And the press reports over the weekend have served to usher more whistleblowers closer towards the light. So there you have it. If HS2 gets to go ahead, this fast train for fat cats will carry on being the scandal that keeps on giving for the next couple of decades. The sensible option is to invest in real, sustainable, local transport initiatives, infrastructure that will get people out of their cars before it's too late, and deliver more benefits to more people more quickly, more sustainably, for a lot less money and without that environmental destruction. I hope you listen and act and stop HS2 before it's too late.